I just wanted to reflect on my own experience. So I came to Port Elizabeth, as it then was, the beginning of 1984, fresh out of university and student politics with a degree in economic history. And I set up an adult education project, and we had offices in Abu's building in Causton. It was in Pearl Road, Causton. And it was very interesting to me because there were trade unions in that building, and I was running an adult education project teaching workers and so on. So it was a good place for me to be, but I didn't know the city at all. So I looked at the map, and it showed this circular road called Pearl Road, and in the middle it shows you there was a dry lake which was drained many years ago, and then around it there were all these streets. And I saw the names of these streets. This is on Braby's map, 1984. It said Mapela Street, Mahawker Street. So I thought, like, this is very odd. I mean, this isn't a residential area for Xhosa people. Clearly, it's not. In fact, most of the buildings there were destroyed. And there were a few industrial buildings, and there was this office block called Abu's building where I had my offices. So I just started getting curious about this. I thought, how can Braby's map of Port Elizabeth, I've just moved to the city, have these African names, but there's not even any streets here. You can't even see where the streets were, let alone any houses there. So I thought, okay, there's a sort of mystery to unsolve. So I started looking into the history of Causton and finding out what else had been written about it. I found Joyce Kirk's thesis. She was a Black American who did a thesis about the early history of Causton. And she found that it was the only place in colonial Cape Colony where African people had freehold rights to property, to land. Amazing, hey? So anyway, this deepened my interest in it. And I found out that there had been a removal in the name of the bubonic plague in the 1930s, when people were moved to McNamee Township in New Brighton. And if you know McNamee, it was called a model township. So they had this quite interesting layout, which is still there if you go there, where the houses are in a circle with a little gang, a little lane. And in the center, there's like a public space, which the people who live in that area can use, and it's quite safe. It's actually really nice. It was called a model township, which the municipality, Port Elizabeth municipality then, built for Black residents who were moved from Causton. Then, a few years later, I did an honors dissertation, and I followed up on this research when I had time. And I went and I found in the municipal archives an archive called the Special Slum Elimination Committee. And I found the documents of the forced removal from Causton in 1956 to 1958. Something like 58,000 people were moved from Causton. And this was actually one of the biggest forced removals in South Africa, but it's hardly written about. It's hardly known about, and it's hardly recognized in Port Elizabeth. So the interesting thing was that it was done in the name of slum elimination, not in the name of the Group Areas Act. And remember, the Group Areas Act was enforced by that stage. So the majority of people there were Black, Xhosa people who had moved, urbanized recently from rural areas. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But there were other people who were moved. I mean, many of the colored residents were moved to Chowderville, which was built as a new township at that point. And the Shona people, who were known as the basket makers of Causton, were deported. They were just put on trains and sent off to Zimbabwe, Rhodesia as it was then. So Causton was basically cleared and of people who were living there. The people who had their property rights there were, I suppose, a sort of elite, if you like, sort of landlords. because they were renting to the newly urbanized migrants from the rural areas. And so they were, using their property to make some income. So they lost their property. There was a big fight. In fact, the ANC at that time, which was still legal, campaigned on their behalf. And I got this information from Governor Mbeki, who was released in 1987 from Robben Island. And I went and consulted him about this history, and he told me how the ANC was caught because it was trying to defend the property rights of the Africans who had property rights. But at the same time, the majority of people were these poor immigrants who they were organizing and mobilizing. So they didn't know quite which class interest to represent, which I thought was quite interesting in itself. Okay, so if you look now, what is in Kouston now, it's called, by some people, Little Mogadishu. There's a whole new wave of immigrants from Somalia, which is why it's called Little Mogadishu. So interesting, huh? I mean, if you go there now, informal traders from East Africa. There's a whole debate now. What should be done about Kouston? How can it be redeveloped, and how should people use it? But for me, this story about Kouston got me thinking about the whole city and how did it develop. So it raises all these questions for us. Who owns the land? Who has claim to land? Okay? Should we even be talking about ownership of land? And we have to go back to pre-colonial times. So we can't start with apartheid South Africa and forced removals. We have to go back to the pre-colonial era. And we know that this area was occupied by Khoi pastoralists. I don't want to go into a debate about terminology and what we call people then and now, but there was a clan or a group called the Gonakwa Khoi who were living here. And a lot of the names that we still use come from there, like Krachakama and Kabecha and so on. So look at the colonial history. 1772, the Dutch East India Company grants loan permits to the Trek Boers. These are the farmers moving up from the Cape, and they're given big pieces of land. They're not very viable. They're doing stock farming mainly here. So that's what they're using the land for. And this Ferreira acquired this farm, Pap and Kuilsfontein. And then the British occupied the Cape. There was a fort at Pap and Kuilsfontein, which was for defense against native attack. And at one stage, and remember, this was now the start of a nearly century of frontier wars over land in the Eastern Cape. But Port Elizabeth is now the harbour, becomes the colonial centre of the area. They said it was the only part of the Eastern Province over which the natives had not gained control. That was in one of the frontier wars. There was the Khoi Rebellion, what we talk about when we've renamed the airport, David Stuurman Airport. This was the rebellion that David Stuurman was involved with leading. And Fort Frederick was then built, but in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, with the guns facing out to sea, as I'm sure you all know. And Pap and Kuilsfontein was even abandoned at one point. The British then relinquished control of the Cape. Pap and the farm reverted to to Ferreira. Ferreira was then arrested, and he was charged with disturbing the peace by cruelties that cry to high heaven committed against the original inhabitants of the land. How interesting is that, eh? Going back so far that they acknowledged the crimes committed against the original inhabitants. British then got Cape Colony back again, okay? Second British occupation. I'm not going to go into the history of the Cape Colony, but if you're not familiar with it, I think it's important to place these events in the context of British colonial rule, because that's how we understand the entire development of the Eastern Cape economy and the Port Elizabeth economy. So then, okay, we move into the 19th century. Corsten acquires this farm and renames it Cradock Place after his friend Sir John Cradock, who stayed there. And he, of course, was the father of commerce in colonial Port Elizabeth. The settlers arrived in 1820, and Corsten was farming wool on that farm I showed you. He passed the farm down to his son. What do we notice there? Land ownership, colonial land ownership. You have legal title to the land, you pass it on to your son, okay? And I think we're familiar with this. I mean, this is now Roman Dutch law, where land gets handed down from father to son. So a whole set of property rights come into play, which never existed among the Khoi, the original inhabitants. They didn't have this system of ownership, passing it down from father to son. So I don't think one must assume that, what we are familiar with is the way that things should be. We should actually question and interrogate whether this form of land ownership is right, whether it is just. So let's look what happened then. We have a series of frontier wars. We have in Port Elizabeth the first recorded strike in South African history of beach workers unloading the ships in this colonial context. And I'll show you here. This is in the, I can't see my own. I think you can see it better than I can see it. This is now where the black residents of Port Elizabeth lived in this period, i.e. from the sort of mid-19th century to the early 20th century. So there were all these locations. I don't know if any of you have seen them, but in Russell Road, there's a cemetery where are still the graves of people who lived in that location. There was, you'll see number 2 was the native strangers location on the map there, right in the center of town. And people were all moved out of the city center in around 1903 when New Brighton was formed. So let's look in the 19th century. You've got this population of the city, which includes the Mfengu, the Khoi, Bechuana, as they called them then. And then, of course, after the mid-19th century, there was this disaster which happened to the Amaxhosa with the frontier war and the cattle killing, which resulted in a complete disruption of the Xhosa population and the destruction of the independence of the Xhosa up to Mpondo land at that stage. So you had massive starvation and people flocking into the urban centers where there was a possibility of gaining some kind of livelihood or some kind of support. So that was a critical moment, and it was actually just at the moment that the municipality was established. And then the municipality has to deal with this influx of people, and at the same time it becomes really the center of colonial trade. So it was called the Liverpool of the Cape, because it was such a big harbor as a center of trade. So what happened was that those inner city locations were forcibly removed. Corsten was then subdivided, and we had this process of industrialization, urbanization, and the poverty, drought, and famine, and as well as the Land Acts of 1913 and 1936, forcing people off their traditional lands and becoming urbanized, proletarianized, as one would say. And Port Elizabeth at that stage was the most rapidly increasing population in the whole of South Africa. It's interesting, hey? So Port Elizabeth actually was such an important economic center at that time. And then I talked about the creation of these model townships for coloureds and Africans in New Brighton. And then, of course, the apartheid government comes into power in 1948 and passes the Group Areas Act in 1950, So have a look at this map. This is now zoning by title deed before apartheid is introduced, okay? So this is in the early 20th century. And you can see there, Bethelsdorp, for example, is mission lands, okay? So this is not owned by white people. There are very small areas which are what they call closed suburbs, which are for whites only. But that whole area, which is dotted, you'll see there, that includes Causton and the areas that we're talking about now, is dotted right down to South End. And that's mixed race, i.e. it's called an open suburb. It's not zoned for any one racial group at that stage. Group Areas Act, of course, changes all this. So the absolute enforcement of residential segregation. So A.J. Christopher, who, I don't know if any of you knew him, he was a professor of geography at University of Port Elizabeth. And he wrote a really useful book called The Atlas of Apartheid as a geographer. And he shows in these series of maps how different, not only Port Elizabeth, but how South Africa was segregated in various ways. And this resulted in not only the group areas forced removals, like from South End, Fairview, Salisbury Park that you would be familiar with, but also Causton, which was not done, as I said, under Group Areas Act, but under a slum elimination plan. And yeah, that was the end of Causton as we knew it. So what was interesting was that when those property owners in Causton were dispossessed, and I think the same applied for some of the group areas removals, people got some limited compensation, the people who were property owners. But of course, the majority of people living there were not property owners. So they received nothing, but the entire community was destroyed. And the destruction of that community was much, can I say, not, I say you can't measure it in the same way that you can measure the value of a property. And you can argue this property was worth this much, this many pounds in 1956. It would have been worth so much today, etc. Did they get compensated fairly? No, they didn't get compensated fairly. But actually, the value is so much more than that, because the value is the value of having a community and an established and secure place to live. So post-94, with the Land Restitution and the Land Claims Court, PELCRA was formed, Port Elizabeth Land Claims and Restoration Association, and they put in many claims on behalf of the residents who were forcibly removed under the Group Areas Act, but not primarily focusing on Causton, because it was done under a different law. So there were a few of the African residents of Causton who were included in that PELCRA claim, but most people were not part of that. So this is now the map of post the Group Areas Act implementation. This is now 1991, okay? So this is just at the time of the transition. And what you'll see clearly is what A.J. Christopher said, that Port Elizabeth, they created a nearly perfectly segregated city. And from the city center, the different racial groups were segregated like spokes from a wheel. So you can see how the different areas are set out. Divided by barriers, so by valleys or freeways, as the Group Areas Act had advocated. So they followed it quite neatly. There's, of course, anomalies. The biggest anomaly, of course, being Walmer Township, which you can see there clearly on the map. Walmer Township, which was scheduled for forced removal, but because in the 70s it was taken up as a cause and was at a time of high high levels of unrest and protest. So it became a bit too dangerous or a bit too much of a hot potato for the council to implement that forced removal. I don't know if anybody here was involved with that campaign in the 70s, but I think it was quite significant that it was retained there. And you can see now, because there's such a disjuncture between the township and the affluent suburb next to it. It's quite interesting how that came about. Okay, so I think it's interesting to reflect on policy now, and if we have a sort of understanding of the history of how this came about, but how do we deal with it? So it's useful to look at policy towards land in different historical periods. So I say broadly, we had a period of colonial dispossession between 1652 and 1910. Then under the Union, we had segregationist policies, so 1910 to 1948. That includes the Land Acts, which were absolutely critical, 1913, 1936. Apartheid policies from 1948 to 1990. Okay, so then what happens? Then we've got a whole new set of policies coming into play from 1994. What is important, I think people should understand the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was set up as an instrument to deal with the injustices of apartheid, did not deal with land. So it had a very narrow and specific mandate to deal with gross human rights violations committed against individuals. And there's been a lot of unhappiness about the Truth Commission in South Africa. People say it didn't bring justice to the victims of gross human rights violations or their families. I think there were limits to the process of the Truth Commission, but I think it did result in quite a lot of truth coming out, evidence coming out, which would not have come out otherwise. But it did not deal with economic injustice. It did not deal with injustice in terms of education or injustice in terms of land. This was not within the mandate of the Truth Commission. So I think that frustration must be put aside and say, how was the government thinking about this? They were saying, Truth and Reconciliation Commission must deal with specific kinds of human rights violation. Land, we will deal with through other processes. And the key process there was land restitution done through the Land Claims Court. That is the process we will use for land restitution. So people had a defined period in which they could lodge their claim with the Land Claims Commission. And if they missed that, then they'd missed the boat. Okay, there was a lot of argument about this because people said they didn't know about it, they weren't, they didn't have access to information, and they then reopened that until I think it was initially until 1998. And then they reopened it, I think, until 2008. But my date is not clear there, sorry about that. Okay, but that was important. But land restitution held back to 1913, to the passing of that act, okay? So you couldn't claim for land that was taken before that. The third issue that we have to look at is policy around land redistribution. And that relates to the question of who actually has claim to the land originally. I mean, before colonial settlement in South Africa or in the Eastern Cape. Which brings me back to the issue about Paarl and Kuilsfontein. Like from 17 whatever, when this land was given. Yeah, so look at the land reform policy in South Africa. It deals with three issues. Restitution. So restitution is to give back, okay? To give back something that was taken. And restitution provides for compensation, and that compensation can be in land if the land is still there, if it's available, if it can be returned to people, government can buy that land and give it back. But it can also be in terms of monetary compensation, and it can also be in terms of what was called a development option. So if you know Fairview here, when you drive down William Moffat, that Fairview area was a forced removal under the Group Areas Act, and it was one of the important claims under PELCRA. In fact, it's one of the biggest restitution claims in South Africa. And the PELCRA committee, with the beneficiaries who were designated as beneficiaries, decided to have a development option, which meant that they didn't just get that big piece of land back. They actually invested the restitution money in a fund which then allowed for the development of that land. So you can see now there's new housing, social housing developments, there's schools, there's all kinds of things going on in Fairview. That's all as a result of this land claim, the PELCRA land claim under the restitution. The redistribution, which is the second leg of this, is done on the basis of policies which try and encourage redistribution of land to black farmers primarily. So it's concerned with farmland, agricultural land, and it's gone through a number of iterations, but one of them, which doesn't affect Port Elizabeth per se, but other parts of the Eastern Cape, is what is called LRAD, Land Redistribution for Agricultural Development. Just if you were my student, I would ask you to leave the class. You know, I was talking about this, about having this thing has dropped.
You may leave the class.
I know, this is being recorded, so I'm a bit self-conscious now. I've dropped this little device here. Okay, so the redistribution, one of the redistribution policies, for example, was called Land Redistribution for Agricultural Development. And black people who wanted to access land for farming could put in an application to be part of this land redistribution program. The land that was redistributed was farmland which government bought and then redistributed. So that was one part of the redistribution program. There have been many criticisms of this, and there's a lot of pressure on government to move faster and redistribute more land. But I think we should be asking a more profound question than the racial distribution of land ownership. We should be asking who needs land and for what purpose? i.e., what do people want land for? And I think this is very important. Just to say, the third leg of the land reform is called tenure reform, and that's a very important law called Extension of Security of Tenure Act, which means that people who've been living on farms or on land for a long period, more than 10 years, cannot be forcibly removed or evicted from that land. So you don't have to be the owner. You can be a farm worker. You can be the child of a farm worker. But you can't just be moved off land that you are living on. And that tenure security is important. It's also reflected, not in the ESTA, but in the act which prevents people from being forcibly moved from houses or flats or anything, any place that they're living. If they're renting a room or a flat from you, you can't evict somebody unless they have alternative accommodation. So it's to provide some kind of security for people. So there's a range of different institutions and laws and policies connected to all of these three legs. And of course, as you know, in the Constitution, there are clauses which do provide security for property rights and for personal security, well, what can I say, security of your person in terms of your dwelling, that you can't be forcibly moved. But there are some conflicts in the Constitution. So there's often conflicts between different rights. You know, your socio-economic rights and the rights to property, for example. So coming to the current situation, I mean, we have lots of conflicts around land in Nelson Mandela Bay now, and this is reflected all over the country, in all the metros particularly. This is just an illustration of people's desperation, you know, that they would have a placard like this saying, "We will die for land." But it's reflected in many, many processes, including struggles over housing provision. And if you know, out in Motherwell, Wells, the new settlements out on in the direction of Kebega, the new RDP housing settlements, they just simply cannot cope with the number of people who need housing. And this process of urbanization from rural areas, which are getting poorer, where there's less employment, there's a loss of jobs in farms, partly due to mechanization, partly due to economic pressure on farmers. People are moving in from rural areas as they were doing 100 years ago. And at the same time, we've got immigration from other African countries which are under even more severe economic pressure and sometimes warfare. So this all combines to put enormous pressure on not only on the economy, but on the authorities in terms of housing provision. So you have all these peripheral townships, informal settlements developing, contestations around how development can happen and where it can happen, and land occupation in some cases. So let me give you one of this. So subsequent to my research on Corsten, I did a research on KwaZulu, which is where people were moved to, and documented the history of KwaZulu. This is now new RDP houses in KwaZulu. This is just at the edge of Struan Way. But I'm going to look at another case, which is Zweledinga, which is in Seaview. And here is a picture of Zweledinga. So Zweledinga is a little settlement. Do you know Zweledinga means the promised land? Am I right, Socks? So the promised land in this forest, beautiful indigenous milkwood forest, with a view of the sea. I mean, you know, if you couldn't find a better place to live, a more beautiful place to live. So this land was occupied in around 2000, again, mostly by people who were not old Port Elizabeth residents, but people who were coming in from from rural areas, from farming areas, and who were looking just for a place to stay. There are no facilities here, and government actually, this is now post-apartheid, new democratic government, promised people that they would receive services, firstly, sewerage, water, electricity, absolutely basic, and then housing. So they would replace the shacks with RDP housing. But after the passing of the Environmental Management Act, the Department of Forestry and Fisheries said, you can't develop this area. This is an indigenous forest, and you're not allowed to cut down trees and put in bulk infrastructure. So I was brought in from development studies to look at whether there could be some form of alternative development in this area where people wanted to stay. So this is a little bit of the history of Zweledinga. You know, it's a very controversial situation because on the one hand, the municipality did acknowledge that community and made promises to them. They obtained environmental authorization for the development of this area. But unfortunately, oh, sorry, now I'm jumping ahead. Let me go back here. Unfortunately, the environmental authorization lapsed, and then the new legislation came into place. So they have not been able to develop that. And to this day, people are still living in those shacks and still have hardly any access to services. So the interesting thing is the option that they were given was to move to one of the new settlements. I think it's called Cove Extension 4 or something, right out past Bethelsdorp. And people didn't want to move there. So they didn't want to be on that housing list because there's nothing out there. It's so far from the city. And people had established a community now in Zinga, where they had certain local economy and service provision and work as domestic workers and so on in neighboring farms and in the suburb of Seaview. But what's interesting to me is people chose to live there, despite the fact that there was such poor conditions. And this is the suburb of Seaview, where this little town, where this little settlement lives. It's not a township because it's not serviced at all. And this is one of the houses for sale in Seaview. You can see how much do you think this house costs? 10 million. Huh? 10 million. It's something around 5 million actually, but still, it's pretty. It's a pretty nice house. This is the description on the website. Anyway, a scenic 20-minute drive to Chief David Stuurman International Airport. Anyway, I find the contradictions and the contrast between these. It's like Walmer and Walmer Township next to each other. This is even worse. This is now Seaview and Zwelodinga next to each other. So this is just one of the little conflicts which have to be resolved. And it's one among many, 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 is around access to land for housing, for residential use, for community. And I think that is the pressing issue in Nelson Mandela Bay. So it's not about agricultural land. It's not about distributing land for food production. It's actually about people having land where they have community. Okay, so let's look at quickly at the problem itself of how we resolve this question of land and justice. There is actually no mechanism to find justice for colonial dispossession before 1913. There's no mechanism at the moment. So there's a whole lot of claims which are now coming forward, which are new claims. And part of this, and this is where it gets very interesting, but I don't have time to go into a lot of this, but do you know that 3 years ago now, government passed a law called the Khoisan Traditional Leadership Amendment Act. And that changed the Traditional Leadership Act in South Africa, which recognizes the traditional leaders, and included Khoisan leaders in that. Okay? So people who are identified or who self-identify as Khoi, I don't understand how easy it is to establish that. But anyway, in terms of the Act, it requires that you have a community who recognize you and recognize your leadership status, which is quite a thin way of verifying. So it doesn't require a deep historical basis or empirical basis for that claim. But then surely, if you can claim that you are a chief of the Gonakwa Khoi in Nelson Mandela Bay, you can have a claim to all the land in Nelson Mandela Bay. How could one possibly deal with that? How can one possibly imagine a government trying to deal with that kind of a claim? It's inconceivable. It's not practical to think about that. So how do we deal with that in terms of justice and finding some kind of just solution. I've talked about the restitution process, which has been limited, but has actually been very important, I think. And I've talked about the Fairview case, where it involves a redevelopment of an area and some monetary compensation. What it doesn't do is deal with the trauma of the destruction of that community. And that is something that we should be involved with as communities, is dealing with that trauma. The other thing that it doesn't deal with is what we call generational wealth. And this is the issue of, in South Africa, of the deepening inequality in wealth. So if you think about old Frederick Corsten, who passed the farm down to his son, etc., the people who were removed from Corsten in 1956 couldn't do that. You know, they couldn't pass down their property to their children. So their children and their children's children are the working class of KwaZulu. They are living in KwaZulu. They are the working class. They have no possibility of class mobility, of obtaining property, etc. Well, they might obtain property in the sense that they will have a municipal house or an RDP house in KwaZulu. And that is a property which RDP house is meant to come with a title deed. The old municipal houses, and remember, municipality built these houses in Macnamee and KwaZulu, site and service. They transferred those title deeds into the name of the people who were living there, the families who were living there, which was argued is a good thing because it gives people some security and some property rights, etc. But it has its own set of problems. So government has had a huge problem and difficulty in implementing this kind of justice through creation of housing, giving of title deeds, and through land reform programs, as I explained. Okay, so I've got a few arguments about this to conclude with. The one is about title deeds. Hernando de Soto, I don't know if you know him, he's a South American economist. He argued that the key for development and for overcoming poverty is to give people legal title to property, and that is what really will make the difference. Because once people have a title deed, they can then use that to get credit and to set up a business and all kinds of things, okay? That's an argument. I'm not completely convinced by this because I don't see the evidence of that working in the case of RDP houses and so on, but it's a debate which is ongoing at the moment. There's an argument that private property has not resulted in the overcoming of inequality in South Africa, but also globally. We've actually seen accumulation and concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. I saw a strange thing the other day about Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and so on, and how their wealth has increased over a 10-year period from, I can't remember the figures, but say $12 billion to $120 billion, some obscene amount like that. And the wage, the minimum wage of American workers has stayed at $12 an hour. And it's just too obscene to think of that kind of inequality. So I don't think that giving people title deeds is going to result in overcoming economic inequality. On the other hand, if you go to the other extreme and you look at this expropriation without compensation, and who has benefited from that, you know, there is a danger, and what happened in Zimbabwe is that effectively a new elite benefited from that process. So if one is going to engage in a very disruptive process, and you know what happened in Zimbabwe in terms of the agricultural economy, it's highly, highly problematic. So to engage in a a radical program like that, you have to look carefully at who's actually benefiting from it, who is going to benefit from it. And again, the answer is not that clear-cut. So there is some areas in Zimbabwe where small farmers who got land redistributed to them have actually benefited. So they're able to make a livelihood where they couldn't before. But in the main, the result of this has been negative because the farms the viable commercial farms were redistributed to, in many cases, absentee landlords or people who weren't even farmers, but who got given the land as part of their party commitment, their loyalty to the ruling party. So you don't want to see this kind of solution adopted in a context where that kind of creation of a new elite is going to be the case, as has happened in the mining industry in South Africa. So I've got I'll maybe come to this in discussion, but I've got a very disturbing example of manganese mining, where people have not benefited at all from that mining. Okay, but if you look at what Julius Malema says, okay, so he says his proposal is that the state should own all the land and people should get a 25-year leasehold to use the land productively. This is mainly talking about farmland. And he says every title deed should be meaningless, which is quite interesting. It's the opposite. No one is going to lose his or her house. No one is going to lose his or her flat. No one is going to lose his or her factory. All we are saying is they will not have the ownership of the land. I think that's quite challenging. Okay, so let's look at some alternative solutions to those two things. On the one hand, everything is solved through giving people title deeds to property. On the other hand, everything is solved through taking away all title deeds to property. So I'm saying, no, like neither of those is the solution. There actually are other solutions which are more based on justice. I think we should focus more on tenure, on security of tenure, of security of shelter, of using common land, public open space, and making that accessible and viable for people to use. That we focus on leasehold rather than on title deeds, like Malema said actually. And we focus also on cooperative ownership, on communal property associations, on body corporates, cooperatives. You can imagine housing cooperatives, blocks of flats, social housing on this basis. And land that is used rather than acquired through speculation, which is important. In the Freedom Charter, it talks about the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. I mean, this is quite sort of literal, applying to agricultural land, but I think we should interpret it in a more broader sense of justice, that people should have access to land for what they need, for security, for housing, for bringing up their families, for having community, for having communal schools, communal gardens, things like that. And just, this is not my creation, this is an organization called the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, and they have devised this Food Sovereignty Act. And this is what they say. I think it has some value. They said we must look at land from both an ecological and a social perspective, how the land is used, that people need, small farmers who want to grow food should have access to 2 hectares. We should have a deconcentration of large commercial farms with fair compensation, state support for food production, and allow for a more egalitarian and more just solution to the land question, and one which focuses on land for security and for production, for use and for development, rather than for profit. So I don't know if you know this. This is an old song about the the diggers of 1649 who occupied some land in England. And they say, no man has any right to buy and sell the earth for private gain. The earth divided, we will make whole to be a common treasury for all. Thanks.